Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to BookNet Canada for inviting me here this afternoon on behalf of Retail Council. We've just established our relationship with BookNet Canada, and we really value that relationship, and we're really looking forward to building a strong partner relationship back and forth with them. I've sat through most of this afternoon, and so much of what you've been talking about is on your side of the business, and they've suggested that I take you behind the curtain to where the retailer sits. I know nothing about books. I read a lot, but I know nothing about the process of getting them to the reader, and I've learned a lot this afternoon. What I hope to give you here this afternoon is a bit of a picture of how the retail trade is performing and what it expects this year and into the future. So you've got a bit of a sense of what's going through the mind of that indie book retailer, that mid-sized regional chain, that large mass merchandise retailer that is carrying your product. So, where do we go? Here we go. Good. Just a quick guidance in terms of where we're going today. As you all know, there has to be a commercial. So I will talk to you a little bit about Retail Council so you know who we are and where we've come from. Then take you through our outlook for this year. This is based on the Retail Conditions Report, which Jen mentioned, which we did last month with about 50 of our largest retailers. And then I'll talk specifically about some retail trends, trying very hard to explain to you what's in it for me. What in that is relevant for you as people in the book business, what some of these trends mean for you as you interact with retailers. I don't know, are there any retailers in the room this afternoon? Oh darn, now I have to tell the truth. Oh, rats, that's too bad. Anyway, welcome, glad that you're here as well. Keep me honest, by all means. So that's roughly the pattern we're going through. Well, first of all, Retail Council of Canada. We are the voice of retail in Canada. The trade association represents the full range of retail. We have all sizes, all channels, all categories, all formats. If you can think of a retail type store, they're a member of Retail Council. It's difficult to count how many members we have because there are different business forms. For example, home hardware is actually owned by each one of those individual home hardware stores. So is it one member or is it 1,100 members? So what we do is we count storefronts, individual units that are selling merchandise to the consumer. And on that basis, we have close to 50,000 members. So you can get a sense that we represent a pretty broad range of the trade. We are a traditional trade association. We do the usual trade association things. We advocate, we speak on behalf of the trade to government, to partners like BookNet Canada and its members. We speak to the media, we speak to the public. We provide education to our members. We've got a number of training programs for retail staff to build skills and talents inside the trade. We run a series of events just as BookNet Canada does as well. We do one on human resources. We have an annual conference. We do one on loss prevention, that sort of thing. And then finally, we have a variety of publications, including the Journal of Record for the retail trade called Canadian Retailer. It's a good read. I can say that because I have nothing to do with it. But it's typically associations produce association rags. It's a very good publication. And if you want to understand what's going on inside Canadian retail, that's a good place to start. It's a good 100,000-foot picture of what's going on. So let's look first of all at what's happening in the trade, what members expect to happen this year. This is general stuff, okay? I simply can't break this down to retailers that carry books or break it down to book-specific retailers. It's just, there are so few of the large and mid-sized companies that are book retailers that we would be revealing corporate secrets. And we don't do that. Well, what are we talking about here? It's, as Casey Stengel famously said, it's deja vu all over again. For about the last 5 years, I've had the sense that I could simply take last year's report out, blow a bit of dust off of it, maybe change the masthead, and send it back out to the members. We've been through some tough times in retail. It's been a challenging period. Slow growth, cautious customers. You all know how you approach a store when you go out there yourselves today. This year, looking ahead, our members expect that their growth will come in a little under 4%. When you figure that there's perhaps 1% of inflation, the population's growing at about 1% a year, that's not a lot of real growth in the retail trade. This is certainly not the go-go years of the early 2000s. Retailers are finding that their market is growing only slowly. The second piece is that competition out there is very tough. With incomes growing slowly, with that slow growth in the market, retailers are looking at each other pretty hungrily and really competing for market share. So they're, at all size levels and in all categories, they're looking for places they can grow their sales, how they can protect the area that they serve currently, whether it's geographic, in terms of product, in terms of demographics. They're working very, very hard to protect and grow their business. Underlying that as well, I think, is a customer who's very cautious. And again, think of your own behavior. This is an uncertain world, not only at the geopolitical level with what's going on in Ukraine, but here in Canada. We're seeing considerable economic change in the country. We're seeing a lot of pressures that cause consumers just to be very careful. Canadian consumers, you may come from anywhere around the world, but when you arrive here, you're injected with a thrifty gene, okay? It doesn't matter. There's a reason why Sandy McTire is on the Canadian Tire Money. They inject that gene into Canadians in a way that they don't, let's say, into Americans. And Canadians really do hunt for value, and so when tough times come along like this, they get very cautious in their shopping behavior. And then the final piece, which I'll talk about a little further on, is an unprecedented set of merchandise cost pressures this year coming on to Canadians. And being in the book business, you lived through Mr. Flaherty calling you out a few years ago on pricing, so you'll understand the particular uniqueness of pricing pressures in the retail trade. So those are sort of the broad outlines of what people are seeing in the retail trade today. Well, I'm going to walk you through a few of the data results. My colleague Leslie Fletcher's here. For those of you who are interested in getting a copy of the report, if you're not members of Retail Council, I think we could give them a freebie, couldn't we? Leslie's saying yes. She's right here in the front. Grab Leslie or me afterwards, and we'd be glad to make sure that you get a copy of the full report. It was mentioned actually earlier this week in Marina Strauss's column in the Globe and Mail as well. First of all, how do you read these charts? What we do is this is a half-hour interview with either the CEO or the CFO of a large or mid-sized Canadian retail company. What we do is aggregate the data, and so what this means is that in terms of the bar, let's say on your right, if you look at that top box, 25%, what that says is a quarter of all the respondents said that their growth this year was going to be greater than 5%. And almost 70% said their growth was going to be between 1 and 5%. So that gives you a bit of a sense of how these graphs play out. You can see how similar it is to the previous year. If I showed 12, 11, 10, maybe even 9, they would all look very much like that. Not a great deal of change over the years. What's interesting is that while retailers do expect, almost 95% of them expect growth to increase this year, they're actually making their inventories work much harder. And for those of you in the room who are suppliers to the trade, this is important to understand. We've seen a process really since the turn of the century, right through, of retailers getting very serious about inventory management, cutting their stocks, increasing the turns that they run through. I'm sure you've seen this. It's a little different in the book business, of course, because they can be returned back to the publisher. But even so, retailers are being very careful about how much inventory they hold in their distribution centers and in their stores. And you get a really good measure of that here when you look at this. 94% say they're going to increase their sales, but less than 2/3 actually plan to buy more merchandise. So what they plan to do is carry less merchandise and sell it through more effectively than they did in the previous years. I think that reflects a couple of things. One is technical progress in business practices. A second thing is just a determination to get better at the business. And I think a third element is just a measure of caution about this year. At the end of it all, they would rather be chasing inventory than chasing sales. They'd rather have to go back and get more product than find themselves sitting on merchandise that they're a little worried they can't sell. And the results of the holiday season have made them doubly that way because it was a surprisingly soft holiday season. Well, this is the big squeeze. Normally we read from left to right. I'm going to go from right to left. What we see here are their predictions for this year in terms of final prices, margins, other costs, and then finally I want to talk about merchandise costs because that's where the really interesting changes are. What you see on what is your far right column is merchants' expectations of their ability to change final prices to the consumer this year. And what you can see is that about 60% of them believe they will be able to change their prices upward, but by relatively little. Most of those, the greater than half who say their price increases will be between 1 and 5, most of them are in the 1 to 2 range. They see really minimal change in prices this year. And of course, we've got almost 40% who say their prices will stay the same or will in fact decline this year. And I'll come back to, the reasons for this really are just the sense that Canadians will not pay more for the merchandise they're buying today. Just will not. Now, the women in the room will understand this, the men don't get shopping, they just don't. But it's just a fact of life that Canadians today are looking for value, will hunt all over the world, will drive across the city to save 5 cents. And that's putting enormous pressure on the full retail trade. If you've been reading the business press lately, you've seen comments about the grocers. They're getting squeezed on a whole series of things, and they're saying, we just don't think we can pass that through to the consumer. The same thing is going on throughout the retail trade. Margins, retailers are optimists. They have to be in the business, so they think they're going to be able to hold or increase their margins this year. Good luck. Other costs, this is labor, transportation, property costs, taxes, those sorts of things. They're going up, but there are no nasty surprises there. They're manageable in the minds of most people. And then finally, merchandise costs. A lot of Canadian retail products are bought offshore and are priced in US dollars. What that means is that from the peak of the dollar at $1.05, $1.06, it's dropped 15% to today, down to 90 cents, 91 cents. That's an enormous increase in their cost in Canadian dollars. And people are really gagging on how to resolve that. They genuinely do not know how they're going to manage that dramatic increase in their merchandise costs. Obviously, that affects books. As you know, many books are produced for the North American market. They're priced with both prices on the back. The consumer sees them. You, with us, went through that unique agony, what was it, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, where we were being called out as bad people. Strangely enough, we haven't heard Mr. Flaherty demand that book prices be raised now that the dollar has dropped. I wonder, maybe he will, who knows. But that cost pressure is being felt by retailers right across the range of merchandise. So, you know, I looked at those results and sort of thought, this just doesn't make sense. So I did a crosstab. There's some more crosstabs on our website on a presentation we did 2 weeks ago. And again, Leslie can probably give you access to that. But I just brought up one here quickly, which is on prices versus merchandise costs. How to read this chart. Across the bottom is those retailers who say their costs went up more than 5%. Their costs went up 1 to 5. Their merchandise costs were flat, or they expect their merchandise costs to go down. And again, you can see then what they expect will happen with their prices. Again, reading from right to left. I must be Chinese. Probably not. What you see is fairly normal behavior in the retail trade for those retailers who expect their merchandise costs will go down, or their merchandise costs will stay steady, or their merchandise costs will go up slightly. That range of experiences is fairly normal for the trade. No unusual signs there. Then you get to the left-hand column and you're left scratching your head. What are these people smoking? What do they expect? Their costs are going to go up by more than 5%, and yet most of them believe, the great majority of them believe, they can't raise their prices equivalently. That's a very difficult situation to find yourself in retail. And to be honest, most of the people that we spoke to, remember this is the CFO or the CEO, they honestly say, I just don't know what we're going to do this year. They're doing a whole series of tactical things, but they are really perplexed as to how to handle this squeeze on their performance in 2014. And I think we will see a lot of games played and a lot of really tough competition on prices. We'll see it in terms of merchandise mix. There's just going to be a lot of dynamic behavior in the trade because people are going to really be wrestling with how to deal with that pressure. Just a quick word on capital expenditure to say that often in a situation like this, the retail trade will eat its seed corn. They're not going to this year. They're continuing to invest. The other key point is that we are going to see more capacity come into the market this year. 71% of them say they're going to be opening additional stores or making existing stores larger. So there will be more retail space chasing that consumer dollar, which means, again, those competitive pressures are going to continue to intensify on the trade. So that's sort of the picture for 2014. Let's look ahead in terms of some broad trends inside the industry. And I would argue that these are affecting specialty booksellers, whether they're indie or larger chains, and they're also affecting those merchants that are selling books as part of a wider range of merchandise. The first piece, and again, you know this as well as I do, Canada has seen a tremendous influx of new players into this country that have come from outside. 30 years ago, the story was that retail was naturally protected. You had to be a Canadian to understand how to sell to the Canadian market. Wrong. Wrong proved. The arrival of these new players has been remarkably good for the Canadian retail trade. It's made us much, much better at our business, but it's been a painful learning process. These new players, the new competitors, and you can just think of the banners that you see in the mall and the power centers on the street fronts. They're bringing new concepts, obviously, to Canada, new ways of selling to the consumer. They're bringing world-class business practices to us. They come with a strong IT base. They come with a strong investment. So these are very strong, powerful, muscular competitors. Because they're able to spread their costs over at least two countries, north-south, Canada, US, or across the full globe, they come here with very low overheads compared to Canadian retailers. So they're very capable competitors. They're very strong in online, and I'll come back to the online world in a minute. There are a couple of things for those of you who are competitors or particularly who are suppliers in here. What we are seeing in this world is some degree of headquarters consolidation. So if you have a large megalithic retailer that's in 8 or 10 countries, they are starting to find that there are some significant economies of scale in pulling back into the main headquarters some of their core headquarters functions. It may be tax, it may be HR, it may be loss prevention, it may be some other functions, but it may also be buying. It may be store design. It may be marketing and promotion. And so what you will find, if you're a competitor or if you're a supplier, is that you're actually interacting with someone who's sitting in another country working on a global basis as opposed to a purely Canadian basis. And they will react differently. If you're supplying to them, you will find that they're looking at the North American market rather than the Canadian market, or they're looking at the English language market rather than purely the Canadian market. They'll have Canada as one of their responsibilities, but it will be a different kind of situation than if you're dealing with somebody sitting in Vancouver or sitting in Calgary or sitting in Montreal. So that is, I think, quite a key difference, is that those who are making decisions, who are making the choices on product, on pricing, on location, on volumes, may or may not be in Canada. And one of the trends that I think we're seeing is that increasingly they will be somewhere else. They will be in a different country, or they may come to Canada occasionally. That's a pattern we're seeing too, is somebody has responsibility for Canada and Mexico. They spend 2 weeks in the US headquarters, they spend a week in Mexico, and they spend a week in Canada every month. So that their perspective on this market, their knowledge of this market is, they just come to it differently than we've seen the retailer in that position in the past. One of the other points I want to make here is that these four trends, I think, all fit together. And I hope as I talk, you get that sense that they interact, that they support each other, and that they're pushing the trade all in certain directions. We've seen considerable consolidation driven by multinationals coming in and taking market share, and consolidation as Canadian retailers have fallen by the wayside, think of the early 1990s, or have merged or themselves bulked up to be competitive against the newcomers. This is really driven then by a bipolar customer. What I'm trying to talk about here is more what's happening inside the trade rather than customer trends. Our expertise is in the retail trade itself. We're not market researchers. Our members understand the market. They don't need us to guide them in that direction. The customer is either moving upmarket for high ego, high personality, high value goods or high importance goods, and moving down market for commodities. Obviously, books fall into that upper category. They may not be high price, but I buy a book because it talks to me as a person. And it's not a commodity in many cases. Share is consistently and steadily moving to the larger competitors. Larger in terms of number of outlets, in terms of size of store, in terms of size of corporation. And what that reflects is a degree of trust that the customer places in that company and a degree of knowledge and familiarity with the firm. I don't know if you remember that famous cartoon of the large fish eating the big fish, eating the medium-sized fish, eating the smaller fish. There's a sense that that's what's going on here. All the way down the chain in terms of size, market share is gradually moving up to the larger players. The mass merchants have been extraordinarily successful in Canada. They've grown very powerful, very large banners, and customers have come to look to them as a first place to go for many of their needs. The big boxes have come to dominate portions of retail in a dramatic way, and then we've seen the large national specialists be very successful as well. Working against that is a whole different trend, and this is one of the things that makes retail fascinating is the moment you think you understand the customer, they change. They just shift their resources on you. So at the same time that customers were eagerly going into stores the size of Luxembourg to do their shopping, we're now finding that they're wanting smaller format stores. And so you see some of the very largest big box players working with smaller formats. What does that mean? Where's that going to take us? I think there are a couple of things that are useful for you as either as retailers or as suppliers to the trade to understand. I think that reflects a desire to serve a customer who's very time poor, who is always in a hurry, who's very focused, who has a list. And this goes back to that point about Canadians being careful shoppers. The shopper doesn't come into the store today and browse. She has a list of things that she has to get today. Again, women know this, men don't. So when she comes in, she expects that store to have the product right there, where she needs it, give it to me, and I'm out of here. The good news is you get a transaction very fast. The bad news is you can't put anything else in the basket. But it does put a great premium then on the retailer knowing their customer brilliantly well, so that they can serve that unique customer in that location at that time. And I'll come back to that in the next slide a little more. For you, again, as competitors or as suppliers to the trade, it means that your interrelationship is with fewer, much stronger, much more sophisticated competitors and much more powerful players. They're able to push their suppliers around in a way that they couldn't, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. The whole nexus has changed right around, and retailers are in a very strong position today. And what I want to reflect on this slide here is what I call the power of retail brands. Again, 30 years ago, national brands really ruled the retail space. You didn't think of going to store X, you thought about buying national brand Y or Z. Again, that's changed around. It's important to understand that because retailers have achieved that position because they now understand the consumer better than most suppliers to the trade. Books are quite a unique circumstance because you always have a unique product. Author X producing title Y, there's no other direct comparator with that. But nonetheless, what you need to understand here is that the retailer has built a very strong relationship with the demographic that is their customer. They know very precisely and very well today, and increasingly well, who their customer is, why they're coming into the store, and what they're looking for, when and how. And they're using that to really tailor, to curate. The current word in retail is curation. What they're trying to do is reduce the number of items in the store, but make sure it's really well designed for that locality, for what that customer wants. So he or she can come in, find what they want precisely, get it, and get out. The other way of looking at this is the retailer has arrived at a position where they're expected by the customer to aggregate their demands that are relevant for that customer when they come to that banner. Obviously, if you go to a supermarket, you have one set of items on your list. If you go to a home store, you have a different set of items on your list. But the customer expects that retailer to know them well enough that they have just the right mix of merchandise for them when they walk in through the door. And retailers have become very, very adept at tailoring each store to that. It's one of the reasons indies are having a real challenge dealing with that. The great strength of an independent store, apart from service and personal knowledge, was that ability to really know that local market. If you had a bookstore in a particular part of the city, you knew your customer really well. The bigger players using data are getting pretty good at that. But right throughout retail, large, mid, and small, they're all really focusing on understanding that customer and bringing a selection, books in your case, in that really talk directly to the customers that come into that store. Coming out of that then is private label. It started with Loblaws in the mid-'80s. We've seen it explode across. I can see you imagining, well, what has this got to do with books? Every book is written by an author. It's unique. Private label doesn't work here. Well, let me give you a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, Hallmark did a series of TV shows in which they contracted and produced a series of TV programs, which had nothing to do with greeting cards. They were just heartwarming stories, which they then advertised in, but put on regular television. They bought slots, and they put these little one-off stories in. They were just TV shows. What they were doing was they're a retailer, they're a vertically integrated retailer. They were creating content, a story, which they were putting out to the public themselves in order to sell their product. Think about that for a minute. There's nothing to stop a retailer from contracting with an author to write a story that supports the products that they sell. Think about that. You know, why can't Victoria's Secret write a series of stories for their customers and put them out there as a promotion, as a complement to the merchandise? Why can't a furniture store do a series of stories focusing on home? So I think you will see retailers, as they try and build the experience that their customer has, looking for ways of adding content to the merchandise that they sell. They're already chasing that today. There's no reason why that couldn't be a book, a video, a story. Lots of opportunities there as we go down the road. And the more that retailers are vertically integrated, where they own the supply chain behind them, or at least have strong contractual relations, the more that becomes potentially possible for them. The other side of this, of course, is what's called frenemies or co-opetition, where as a supplier, you're selling the product directly to the consumer, but you also have retailers that are selling the same product. Very common in electronics. Sony is a good example. Samsung would be another, where they have their own stores where they sell some product. Nike would be a third, where they sell the product directly, but the retailer also sells exactly the same product. I think we'll see more of that, particularly where brands are concerned. But let's take this another step. We've seen battles break out in the music business, which again is very analogous to books. We've seen retailers refuse to carry certain artists because the artist has a relationship or has put it out in a different channel first. Equally, we've seen retailers do an exclusive with an artist and have that artist only in their store. You know, you can see all of these trends are going to come into the book business, and if retailers can see an opportunity there to exploit it, to get a step ahead of one of their competitors, to enrich the experience their customer has in the store, they will use those. I think there's potential there to work with retailers to build that. And again, if you're a retailer, there are opportunities here for you, whether you're large, mid, or small, to use the technology, to use those opportunities to give your customer something that's unique, that makes your store stand out, that makes your store special to the retailer and his or her interests and needs. Well, I couldn't come here to a book show without at least one literary reference. I tried very hard to get book titles for all of the other slides. I racked my brains and just couldn't come up with them, so Aldous Huxley got the call. it, this is, listening to you folks this afternoon has been so useful for me. I had no idea the way technology has pervaded the book publishing business. That's happening throughout retail. It's also happening, obviously, in the interface with the consumer as well. And again, all of you are very familiar with that. There are a couple of pieces here that are most relevant for retailers. The first is that retail now is truly international. The customer can shop anywhere in the world they want. I think the best example of this was 2 Decembers ago. There was a British fashion online retailer that had billboards in Toronto, boohoo.com. They were advertising for Canadian business. Okay? A billboard is $60,000. Okay, and they had a number of them. So they are getting enough business from Canada to make it worth their while to advertise on billboards around Toronto to sell their product to the consumer. That's just a measure of how much the Canadian consumer shops the world just automatically as a matter of course. Think about your own patterns. You check it out. The key point behind this is that the Canadian retail trade, and I've said this to retailers directly and publicly, is Canada lags behind. The Canadian consumer is a little more conservative than, let's say, American customers. And so they were a little slower coming to online commerce than in other countries. But the Canadian retail trade has also been behind best practice in the United States and elsewhere in the world. They've moved into this a little more cautiously and a little more slowly. They've probably lost less money as a result, but they are behind in terms of practices. And that's when the customer easily can find out the very best of the very best in the world. Your website in Canada can sometimes suffer in comparison. And the customer knows it. That's a challenge that's keeping an awful lot of our members awake right now. A little example is mobile commerce. It's a way of doing business in the States. It's still rarely mentioned by our members here. It's just that they're a little behind in terms of their operations. Again, sort of stepping another step back from that, it's easy to think that this is all driven by technology. In fact, it's the consumer. You know, it started with an observation somebody made many, many years ago now, which was that the consumer has more technology in their home computer than they have in the computer they're using at the office. The technology that the consumer has in their cell phone, in their desktop or their laptop or their pad at home is so advanced that they are figuring out new ways of using it and teaching all of those with whom they interact. And that's the case whether it's a community group, it's politicians, it's a retailer, or it's the producer of a product. The consumer has taken to technology, is playing with it, especially the younger generation, and they are letting us know very clearly how they want to use technology. Very early days, but they are really driving this. It would be a mistake to think this is driven by the nerds. It's not. It's driven by our 14-year-old kids. And indeed by grandmothers. All of them are playing with this technology, using it, finding new ways of finding product, learning about it, exchanging ideas on it, making decisions. They're pushing and pulling this capacity in directions that we just can't imagine today. And they will continue to do so. That's important because the holy grail, the nirvana that retailers are trying to get to is called the omni-channel universe, where everything is seamless, transparent. The customer has exactly the same experience whether she's online, on the phone, in the store, one store to another, picking up, dropping off, whatever it is. It's a seamless, coherent process that's just absolutely so easy to use for the consumer. Great idea, difficult to execute, and there's a real burr under the saddle of that horse, and that is that the customer shops differently. What's become very obvious as we've gone through the online world is that as much as the customer wants to have an identical experience, they behave very differently online than they do in stores. And that's really turning retailers inside out right now. The customer's saying, what's that great play? I love you, you're perfect, now change. That's exactly what's going on with the customer. I love your stores, they're perfect, now I want them different. And that's going to go on for an extended period of time as customers figure out how to use this technology. And let's remember, we've been operating something called like a store for maybe 10,000 years. We've been running websites that sell for a little over 10 years. You know, the learning curves are a little different. And that's going to go on for a while. So retailers are going to continue to struggle to understand how this works because their customer is struggling and being remarkably creative in how they use this technology. And that will carry on. The final thought I'll leave you with here is that the internet is about price. It is for so many products, it is all about price. It is so transparent. It's so easy to move from one site to another. There are comparison sites. I mean, there are 2 or 3 websites now that compare Amazon prices with others. You know, the customer has almost perfect information. So much power has been given into their hands that they're going to be able to really drive and dictate how they manage in this world. So it is going to be just a dramatically different environment in which retailers have to make their living in the future. So that's sort of a quick canter through what's happening in retail today. The slides, Lauren had asked that I put this up for you. The slides are on the website. And as I say, both Leslie and I are here to give you any information on Retail Council, or if you want to give us your cards, we can make sure that you get the report, or give you access to the other presentation that I did, which has, I think, a couple of other graphs on the crosstabs if you want to drill into them and get a better sense of what's happening this year. But otherwise, that's sort of, as I say, a quick look at 2014 and some of the tectonic shifts that we think are happening in retail over the next 4 or 5 years. Thank you very much, and I hope the rest of the conference goes well.